The snow had been falling since noon over Kettle River, and by 6 o'clock it had buried the parking lot of the Birch Hollow Diner, deep enough that headlights swept the windows like searchlights every time a truck fishtailed in off the highway. Inside, the place was warm and loud, the griddle hissing, the coffee machine gasping, forks scraping plates, the whole small room fogged with the smell of gravy and cold, wet wool. Jonah Prescott sat in the last booth by the window with his back to the wall the way he always sat, and he was not watching the storm. He was watching the young woman refilling coffee 3 tables down, because something in the set of her shoulders had gone wrong. He knew that particular stiffness. He had learned it the way some men learn a trade, slowly, and then all at once in a place a long way from Ontario where the light came down white and flat, and a person's body told you the truth a half-second before anything happened. Fear had a posture. It pulled the shoulders up toward the ears, and it made the hands too careful. The waitress had that posture now, and the reason for it was sitting in a booth, wearing a charcoal overcoat that cost more than Jonah's truck payment, snapping his fingers in the air as though the whole diner were his personal staff. Across the table from Jonah, his daughter was drawing a moose in the margin of the paper placemat with a crayon the color of dried mustard. Elsie Prescott was 8 years old and had strong opinions about moose antlers, and she was explaining these opinions in a low, steady stream that Jonah had learned to hear and love without needing to interrupt. She had her mother's chin. He tried not to think about that too often, but the diner light did something to it, and for a second the ache moved through him and out again the way it did. Then a plate hit the floor and the whole room turned. The waitress had stepped back too fast. The man in the charcoal coat had shoved himself up out of his booth so hard the bench barked against the tile, and the tray in her hands had tipped, and a cup and saucer and a plate of eggs went down together in a bright shatter. Coffee soaked the front of her apron. She stood there with her hands still curled around nothing, and the man leaned in close. "How hard is it," he said in a voice pitched to Carrie, "to walk 10 feet without making a scene of yourself?" The room went quiet the way rooms do when everyone decides at once to pretend they are not listening. The griddle kept hissing. Somewhere a spoon clinked and stopped. "I'm sorry, sir," the waitress said. She said it low and even, and she bent to gather the broken pieces, and that was when Jonah noticed the thing that did not fit. Her hands were steady. Not the steadiness of someone who was calm, but the practiced kind, the kind a person builds on purpose over a long time, a stillness held down over something else. She was not simply frightened. She was choosing, moment to moment, not to answer this man the way she could. The man did not let her gather the pieces. He stepped in closer instead, his shined shoes an inch from the mess. "This," he said, gesturing at the floor, at her, at the whole steaming disaster of her, "is exactly why people like you spend your whole life carrying other people's plates." Jonah felt his daughter go still beside him. Elsie had stopped drawing. The crayon hovered over the moose. She was 8, but she was not stupid, and she had learned, in a house that had known its share of hard silences, to read the exact temperature of a room. She looked up at her father, and what she saw in his face made her small voice come out smaller. "Dad," that was all. Just the one word. She knew that word did a lot of work these days. Jonah was already moving. He set his coffee down without spilling it, which some part of him noted with the flat approval of an old habit, and he slid out of the booth and stood, and the stormlight from the window put a long shadow across the floor. He was not a large man. He was maybe 6 feet, lean the way work made a person lean, in a flannel gone soft at the elbows and a canvas jacket with a torn cuff. But there was a way he crossed the room that made the 2-line cooks behind the pass stop what they were doing, and the man in the charcoal coat turned, annoyed, expecting to face down some retired farmer come to lecture him about manners. Jonah stopped between the man and the waitress. Close enough. Not touching. "You're going to sit down," Jonah said. His voice came out low and unhurried, the way it did when it mattered most, and that was worse than shouting, and every person in the room understood it. "And you're going to leave her alone." The man looked him up and down, taking in the frayed cuff and the worn boots and the exhaustion sitting under Jonah's eyes, and he laughed. It was a short, ugly, comfortable sound, the laugh of a man who had never once in his life been made to face the size of himself. "Do you have the faintest idea," the man said, "who you're talking to?" Jonah held his eyes. "No," he said, "but I've met your kind before. Overseas, mostly. You always think the uniform's the coat." For one long second, nobody moved. Snow ticked against the glass. The man's jaw worked, and something flickered behind his eyes, the first small crack in a face that was used to being agreed with. And near the register, quietly, the waitress lifted her head. When she looked at Jonah, the fear was still there on the surface, but underneath it there was something he had not expected. It was cool. It was measuring. It was the look of a person doing arithmetic that no one else in the room could see, adding up the man in the coat and the man in the flannel and the whole storm of the moment, and arriving silently at a total. She looked at Jonah Prescott the way you look at a door you did not know was there, because the woman standing in the ruined apron with coffee soaking through to her skin was not a waitress. And in 11 hours before the plows had finished the first pass down the Trans-Canada, this man's name and Jonah's face were going to be on every phone in the province, and only one of them was going to survive it. The man in the coat decided, the way bullies do, that the smart move was to make it small. He straightened his lapels. He looked around the room as if collecting witnesses to his own restraint. "Enjoy your dinner," he said to Jonah, with a smile that did not touch anything. He dropped a 50 on the table without looking at it, the kind of gesture meant to be seen, and he walked out into the snow, and the cold came in behind him, and then the door swung shut. The room let out its breath. Somebody laughed nervously. The waitress crouched down at last and began picking up the broken plate, and Jonah crouched with her before he had thought about it, gathering the larger shards into his palm. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, not looking at him. "No," Jonah agreed. He put a piece of the saucer into her hand, careful of the edge. "But I've got a kid watching. Seemed like a bad thing for her to see, and a worse thing for her to see me sit through." The waitress glanced past him to the booth, where Elsie was watching them both with enormous, unblinking seriousness. Something moved across the woman's face, quick and gone. "She yours? She is? She's lucky," the waitress said, and there was a weight in it that did not fit a woman apologizing over a broken plate. And Jonah heard it and filed it away without knowing why. He helped her to her feet. Up close, he saw that her hands, still steady, had older calluses than a serving job would leave, in the wrong places, and that the plain silver watch on her wrist was the kind of plain that costs a great deal to be. He did not say anything about it. He had learned overseas that the fastest way to lose a person's trust was to let them see you noticed too much. "You should get out of that apron before you catch cold," he said. "Coffee's soaked through." She looked down at herself, and something in her almost smiled. "It has," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." "Jonah, thank you, Jonah." She did not offer her own name, and he did not push. The diner owner, a big, soft-spoken man named Gus Tremblay, who had been running the Birch Hollow for 30 winters, came out from behind the counter with a mop and a face full of apology, and the small, ordinary machinery of the night resumed. Jonah went back to his booth. Elsie had drawn a second moose, larger and fiercer than the first, standing guard over the smaller one. She turned the placement around so he could see it. "That one's you," she said, pointing at the big moose. Then she pointed at the small one. "That one's her. She's scared." "She's okay now," Jonah said. Elsie considered this with the gravity of a small judge. "For now," she said, and went back to her fries. They drove home through the storm in the old truck with the heater that only worked on the highest setting, the wipers thumping, the plow lights strobing gold ahead of them on the empty highway. Jonah lived 20 minutes out of town in a bungalow his grandfather had built, on a lot too big to heat and too small to farm, and by the time he got Elsie into bed with her socks still on because the floors were cold, he had mostly stopped thinking about the man in the charcoal coat. He stood at the kitchen window a while with a cold coffee, watching the snow come down through the yard light, and he thought about his wife the way he did every night at this hour, out of habit and out of need, and then he washed the cup and went to bed. He did not know that a 19-year-old at the counter had filmed the whole thing on her phone. He did not know that by the time he'd fallen asleep, the clip was 300 shares deep and climbing, and that some careful person had already clipped it down to the 11 seconds that told the wrong story. A rough-looking man in a torn jacket rising out of a booth, stepping into a well-dressed man's space, saying you're going to leave her alone in a voice that sounded without the context like a threat. He did not know that the man in the charcoal coat was named Roland Vance, that Roland Vance was the regional director of operations for a company whose name was on half the storefronts in 3 provinces, and that Roland Vance had a communications team and a personal lawyer and a very particular way of making sure a story landed the way he needed it to land. Jonah found out the way you always find out, slowly and then all at once. It started with the phone. His first service call was canceled at 6:40 in the morning, a text from a grocery manager he'd worked with for 6 years. "Sorry, Jonah, going a different direction this quarter." He read it twice, frowning, and set the phone down, and by the time the coffee had finished dripping, there was another. The Legion Hall, where he'd serviced the walk-in cooler every spring since he'd come home. Then the senior's residence out on Birch Line. Then a name he didn't recognize, a corporate account, canceling a contract he hadn't known he was about to lose. By 7:30, he had lost 4 accounts, and he still did not understand why. He stood in the kitchen with his phone in his hand and a cold feeling spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with the storm, and he made the mistake, then, of searching his own name. The video came up first. It had a headline over it now on a local news site, and the headline had already changed twice. The version he was looking at said, "Local veteran confronts businessman in tense diner standoff." Under it, in the comments, the town was busy being itself. Somebody had found an old photograph of him in uniform, 19, and squinting into the Kandahar sun, and somebody else had turned it into evidence. "Anger issues," one comment said. Another said, "These guys come back wound too tight, and I feel for them, but you can't have them in the community." "Where was the staff?" said a third. "Where was security?" "He should be charged." There was no context. There was no coffee soaking through an apron. There was no 8-year-old going still in a booth. There was just 11 seconds of a hard-looking man rising to loom over a smaller one, and a town that already half believed the story before it started reading. Elsie came into the kitchen in her school clothes with her backpack over one shoulder, and she looked at his face and stopped in the doorway. "Are we in trouble?" she asked. She had a way of cutting straight to the shape of a thing. "We're fine," Jonah said, and turned the phone face down. "You did the face," Elsie said. "When you say we're fine and you do the face, it means no." He crouched down in front of her and fixed the strap on her backpack that was always slipping, and made himself smile all the way up into his eyes, which took an effort she was too young to see and too smart to miss. "It means we've got a hard day," he said. "Not the same as trouble. We've had hard days. We're good at them." She studied him. "Okay," she said in the voice of someone filing a complaint they'll return to later, and she let him drive her to school. On the way back, a black SUV with plates too clean for February slowed as it passed his mailbox, idled at the end of his lane for 3 long seconds, and pulled away. Jonah watched it go in the mirror, and something old woke up in the back of his mind, quiet and cold and precise. He did not chase it. He noted the direction, the plate cluster, the tint, the pause, and he tucked it away. And he told himself he was tired and imagining the shape of a threat where there was only a lost driver in the snow. He did not believe himself. His next call was across town at a strip mall, a bakery whose freezer had been dying by degrees for a week. When he pulled in, there was a notice taped to the front door of the shop, and the shop was dark, and the notice was a single sheet of printer paper that said, in a font meant to look official, that the tenant service agreements were under review and no unauthorized contractors were to be admitted to the premises. There was no signature on it, there was no explanation, just the fact of it flat and final the way real power always speaks. Not with an argument, but with a locked door. Jonah stood in the cold with the paper going soft under the falling snow, and he crumpled it slowly in one fist, and behind him he heard a car pull into the lot. He turned. It was a silver sedan he half recognized from the diner parking lot the night before, and the woman who got out of it was wearing dark jeans and a plain gray coat and sunglasses against the snow glare. And she looked nothing at all like a waitress, and everything like the person he had half seen doing arithmetic behind a frightened face. "You followed me," Jonah said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't quite an accusation. The woman took off the sunglasses. Up close, in daylight, she was maybe 40, with a face that had learned to give away nothing, and eyes that missed nothing in return. "Your truck has your business name and phone number painted across the side," she said. "It wasn't hard. Then you already know it's not much of a business anymore." He gestured at the dark shop, the paper in his fist. "You come to apologize? Because if the plan is you feel bad and I feel worse, we can skip it." "I didn't come to apologize," she said. "I came to warn you." Jonah gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "I've had all the warnings I need this morning." She looked past him, up the empty street where the plow had left a wall of gray snow along the curb. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The apologetic softness was gone out of it. What was left was flat and certain, the voice of someone who has spent a long time being right about unpleasant things. "The man from the diner is named Roland Vance," she said. "He is a regional director for a company that operates in 3 provinces: grocery, hospitality, food service. And Roland Vance does not stop when he's been embarrassed. He escalates until the person who embarrassed him submits or until they're gone. Those are the only 2 endings he's interested in." "I noticed," Jonah said. "The SUV that idled at the end of your lane this morning," she said. "That's part of it." He went still. "How do you know about that?" "Because I know how he works. It's not surveillance, not really. It's a message. He wants you to see it. He wants you lying awake tonight, wondering if it'll be there tomorrow." She tilted her head, watching him. "How many accounts have you lost since 6 this morning?" Jonah's jaw tightened. 6, he said. He hadn't counted, but the number was there when he reached for it. "By noon, you'll lose more. He'll get to the ones who owe him favors first. The independents will fold because they're afraid, and the corporate accounts will fold because they've been told to. By the end of the week, you'll have nothing left in this town, and you'll start thinking about moving, and that's the point at which he considers the matter closed. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. Snow gathered in her dark hair, and she didn't brush it away. "You talk like you've read his schedule," he said. "I've read worse than his schedule." "Then who are you?" Jonah said. "Really? Because you're not a waitress. Your hands are wrong for it, and your watch is wrong for it, and you didn't blink when I said the SUV, and a real waitress on a bad tip night doesn't chase a stranger across town in the snow to warn him about a regional director." For the first time, something like respect crossed her face. She was quiet a moment, and the snow came down between them. "My name is Simone Beaumont," she said, "and the company Roland Vance works for is mine." The name did not mean anything to Jonah, but the way she said it did. He said nothing. He waited, the way he'd learned to wait, and she went on. 11 years ago, I built a company out of a single grocery store my father left me when he died," Simone Beaumont said. "It's a large company now, large enough that I stopped being able to see it. Every number I got was polished before it reached me. Every store visit was staged 3 days in advance. Complaints didn't come up the chain. They came up the sanitized version of the chain. So twice a year I do something the board thinks is reckless. I put on an apron and I take a name badge that isn't mine and I go work a shift in one of my own locations and I find out what my company actually is when it thinks no one important is watching. And last night you found out," Jonah said slowly. "Last night I found out what Roland Vance is like to the people under him when he thinks they're nobody," she said. "I'd heard the complaints. There were always complaints, and there was always a reason they went nowhere. He's very good, you understand. He hits people who can't hit back. And I'd been circling him for a year without proof, because proof in my world has to be the kind that survives a lawyer." She looked at Jonah, and something in her expression was almost an apology after all. And then a refrigeration mechanic in a torn jacket stood up in a diner and gave him something he couldn't resist. A story where he's the victim, a rough veteran who threatened him. He couldn't help himself. He spent all night building it, and this morning he started making you pay for it, and he has no idea that the woman he humiliated for dropping a tray owns the ground he's standing on. The snow fell. A plow went by on the far street with its lights turning, and the cold blue of it moved across both their faces and passed. "Why are you telling me this?" Jonah said. "Because he's going to destroy your business to protect his story," Simone said, "and I'm not going to let him. But I need something from you, and I want to be honest that I'm asking you for it, because you've had enough people this morning ask you for things they didn't have the decency to name." She held his gaze. "The board meets in 2 days. I've called it. I'm going to lay out a year of complaints against Roland Vance, and I'm going to end his career in front of the people he's spent that career impressing. But complaints on paper are easy for a man like him to survive. Numbers he can argue. What he can't argue is a room full of people watching him be exactly what he is. I want you there, Jonah, in the room. Not to speak unless you choose to, just to be the thing he can't turn into a headline, the face he made a story out of, standing there refusing to be a story." Jonah thought about it. He thought about the 6 accounts and the locked door and the black SUV and his daughter saying, "You did the face." He thought about pride, which he'd learned the hard way was a luxury that cost other people, usually the smallest ones. "I have a daughter," he said. "Whatever this does, it lands on her too, I know," Simone said. "That's why I'm telling you the whole thing instead of the flattering half of it." She paused. "For what it's worth, I've watched a lot of people find out I own the company. Most of them get very agreeable, very fast. You asked who I really was before I told you, and you asked because you were worried about a woman you thought was a waitress. That's rarer than you'd think. That's most of why I'm standing in a parking lot in a snowstorm instead of letting my lawyers handle it." Jonah looked down at the crumpled notice in his fist, then out at the gray street, then back at her. "Tell me when," he said. The 2 days between were the longest Jonah had spent since the ones he did not talk about. The accounts kept falling, exactly as she'd said they would in the order she'd said, and there was a particular horror in watching a prophecy come true one text message at a time. But Simone Beaumont, it turned out, kept prophecies of her own. The morning after the parking lot, an envelope arrived by courier, hand-delivered against the storm, and inside it was a retainer agreement for commercial refrigeration maintenance across 9 locations, a full year, signed. Jonah stared at it for a long time, and then he called her and told her he didn't take charity. "It isn't charity," she said, sounding faintly annoyed as if he'd insulted her competence. "I pulled your service records from the 4 accounts of mine you already had. Your response times are better than my in-house maintenance department's, and you charge less, and in 6 years, you've never once padded an invoice, which, believe me, I checked. If anything, I'm underpaying you. Take the contract, Jonah. It has nothing to do with the diner. It has to do with the fact that you're good at your job and I'm tired of paying people who aren't. He took the contract. Some knot in his chest tied hard since 6 o'clock the first morning, loosened by a single turn. He did not tell Elsie the details. He told her they were going to the city for a day, that a woman he'd met needed his help with something at her work, and that afterward, if she was good, they'd go to the big library with the glass ceiling. Elsie packed her own backpack with 3 books and the mustard-colored crayon and a granola bar, and on the drive down the Trans-Canada she asked, watching the frozen lakes slide past, "Is it the scared waitress?" "It's her," Jonah said. Except it turns out she was never really scared, and she was never really a waitress. Elsie thought about that for most of a lake. So she was pretending, she said, so the mean man would think she was small, something like that. That's smart, Elsie decided. You can't hit somebody right if they let you think they're small. She said it the way children say things, offhand, having no idea they've just described the whole shape of the world. The company's head office was a tower of gray glass downtown, and the boardroom on the 30th floor had a wall of windows that looked out over a city gone white and pewter under the winter sky. Jonah sat in a chair against that wall in a clean flannel and his one good pair of boots, with Elsie beside him drawing quietly. And he watched 12 people in expensive clothes file in around a long table, and he understood, in a way he hadn't fully before, exactly how far above Roland Vance's world he was supposed to be. Simone had told the board he was a witness. She had not told them to what. Roland Vance came in last, and when he saw Jonah against the window, his step faltered for half a heartbeat before smoothing over. He recovered fast. He was good, Simone had said, and he was. He crossed to the table and took his seat and folded his hands and looked for all the room to see, like a man mildly puzzled to find a stranger at an important meeting. Simone Beaumont did not sit at the head of the table right away. She stood by the window a moment, looking out at the city, and then she turned, and the whole room quieted the way the diner had quieted, and Jonah realized he was watching her put down the last of the disguise. Not the apron, the apology, the softness. She let it go, and what stood there instead was the woman who had built all of this out of one store, and it was very quiet in the room. "Some of you have seen a video this week," she said. "A veteran, they're calling him. A veteran with anger issues, confronting one of our regional directors in a diner in Kettle River." She let that sit. "I was there. I was the waitress in the video. The one dropping the tray." The room went absolutely still. What followed, Jonah would remember for the rest of his life, was not loud. Simone Beaumont did not raise her voice once. She simply began quietly to lay the truth on the table one piece at a time, and there was no argument that could stand against the weight of it accumulating. She had complaints going back years from servers and stockers and shift managers, filed and quietly buried, each with the same shape. Roland Vance, cruel to the people with the least power to answer, careful never to leave a mark on anyone who could hurt him back. She named the servers who'd quit. She named the manager who'd been fired for filing a report. She played on the screen at the end of the room a security recording from a break room in a store 2 provinces away, Vance leaning over a teenaged cashier in exactly the posture Jonah had seen in the diner. And the room watched a man they had all trusted become in real time the thing they had refused to see. Roland Vance argued, of course he argued. He was smooth and he was practiced, and he talked about isolated incidents and disgruntled former employees and the danger of trial by anecdote. And for a few minutes it almost worked, because the board wanted it to work, because the alternative was admitting what they'd let live in their own house. Jonah watched them wanting to be convinced. He watched Simone watch them wanting it, and then Simone Beaumont laid down the last piece, and the room stopped being able to want anything at all. 12 years ago, she said, still quiet, still even. Before this was my company, when I was buying up regional assets, Roland handled cost reduction on the health benefits side of an acquisition. Rural coverage. He recommended withdrawing our contribution to a shared emergency services fund that kept a rapid approval program running at 3 county hospitals. It saved us $400,000 a year. The board approved it on his numbers. The program closed. She turned at last and she looked at Jonah, and her face changed, and he understood a beat before she said it, that she was about to hand him something she'd carried for 2 days without letting him see the weight of it. One of the hospitals was in Kettle River. The program that closed was the one that handled emergency treatment approvals for the regional cancer unit. It added a delay to approvals, weeks sometimes. The room did not understand yet. Jonah did. He felt it come up through the floor of him. Jonah Prescott's wife was treated at that unit, Simone said. Catherine Prescott. 4 years ago. The delay in her case is documented. I have the file. The boardroom was completely silent. Elsie had stopped drawing. She was looking at her father with her mother's chin lifted and her eyes very large, not fully understanding enough. Jonah did not move. He was looking at Roland Vance, and Roland Vance, for the first time since the diner, had nothing on his face at all. The practiced ease was gone. What was under it was small. That policy, Vance said, and his voice had lost its carry, came out of legal and finance. It was a cost reduction. It was signed off at 4 levels above. You recommended it, Simone said. Your name is on the recommendation. You built the number that made it easy to say yes to. She did not raise her voice. She never once raised her voice. You didn't know whose wife you'd cost. Neither did I until 2 days ago when I pulled the file to understand why a refrigeration mechanic would stand up in a diner and put his whole livelihood on the line for a stranger. He didn't do it because he knew who you were. He did it because he can't watch someone be crushed and stay in his seat. You'd know something about that, Roland, if you'd ever once in your life been the person who couldn't hit back. The board chairman, a heavy, quiet man named Emmett Shaw, who had said nothing the entire meeting, rose slowly to his feet, and he did not look at Vance, and he said one word into the intercom on the table. Security. 2 men in gray came into the room almost at once as though they'd been waiting, which they had. Roland Vance looked around the table one last time, and Jonah watched him do the arithmetic Simone had done in the diner, watched him add up the room and search it for a single ally and find none, watched him understand, all at once and far too late, that the authority he'd hidden inside his whole life had quietly stepped out from around him and left him standing alone in the open. He got up, he straightened his lapels, the same gesture from the diner, and this time it fooled no one, least of all himself. Jonah spoke then for the first time and only once. He hadn't planned to. He wasn't sure afterward that he'd decided to. It came out low the way it did when it mattered, and the whole room held still to hear it. Power doesn't build a man, Jonah said. It just takes off the mask he was already wearing. No one answered because there was nothing to add. The 2 men in gray walked Roland Vance out of the boardroom, and the door closed behind him, and the silence he left was heavier than anything he'd said inside it. For a long moment the board simply sat there, looking at the file on the screen, looking, Jonah thought, at their own company for the first time without the polish on it. Then Emmett Shaw cleared his throat and, in the flat, careful voice of a man doing the only decent thing left, announced an emergency suspension of every account frozen or canceled under Vance's direction that week. A full external audit of every buried complaint, restitution for the affected franchisees and staff, and a formal review of the 12-year-old benefits decision with an eye to what could still, at this late hour, be undone. It was too little and too late for the one thing that mattered most, and every person in that room, including Jonah, knew it. But he had learned a long time ago that too late is not the same as never, and that a wrong named out loud in a room full of the people who allowed it is its own small kind of justice, even when it can't give anything back. He found Simone in the hallway afterward, standing at the window with both hands in her coat pockets, looking down at the traffic crawling through the snow far below. Elsie had fallen asleep against his shoulder on the walkout, and he shifted her weight as he came to stand beside the woman who 2 days ago had been dropping a tray in his hometown diner. You were right, Simone said without turning, about the mask. I wasn't trying to be right, Jonah said. I was just tired. She glanced at him then, and something in her face let go, the last of the armor she'd been wearing all afternoon. You could have said no in the parking lot, she said. It would have been the smart thing. You'd have kept your head down and let me handle it and probably kept more of your accounts. Why didn't you? Jonah thought about it, the sleeping weight of his daughter warm against him. Because staying in your seat costs more than it looks like, he said. I found that out 4 years ago. I'm done paying it. Simone nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd suspected about him from the first, and did not say anything else for a while, and the 2 of them stood watching the snow fall on the city, and it was for both of them a strange and unfamiliar quiet. The quiet of a thing set right, or as right as it was going to get. That night she drove north with them, back up the dark highway to Kettle River, and Gus Tremblay had kept the lights on at the Birch Hollow, even though the sign in the window said closed, because Simone had called ahead, and because Gus, it turned out, had known who she was for about a day and had been sworn to a delighted silence. Inside, under the warm yellow lights, with the storm finally spent and the snow lying deep and blue and quiet across the parking lot, Elsie woke up enough to be led to the booth in the far corner. The same booth, and she slid in and looked across the table at Simone Beaumont with the frank appraising stare of the very young. So, Elsie said in a voice that meant she had been thinking about this, are you a waitress, or are you the boss? Simone laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. She slid into the booth across from the girl. Tonight, she said, maybe both. Elsie weighed that and found it acceptable and pushed the mustard-colored crayon across the table toward her as if that settled the matter of them being from now on the same side. Gus poured coffee that nobody had ordered. Jonah stood at the counter and watched his daughter draw a moose for a woman who owned a company in 3 provinces. And he felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, something that had gone quiet 4 years ago and that he'd assumed was simply gone. Outside, the town was still talking. The video was still spreading, though the headline had begun overnight to change again, the way headlines do when the truth finally gets its boots on. There would be new problems in the morning. There always were. Neither courage nor a signed contract nor a company's guilty conscience could erase a bad week or a locked door or the $400,000 a year that a delay had cost once in a hospital up the road. Jonah knew that. He had stopped expecting the world to stay fixed once you fixed it. But inside the Birch Hollow, under the yellow light, with a pie cooling near the register and his daughter laughing at something the boss of everything had said, the noise of all of it felt very far away. For the first time in longer than he could measure, Jonah Prescott did not stand there braced for the next blow. He just stood and listened to Elsie laugh and let it be enough, and out past the window, where the plow lights turned slow gold circles at the end of the empty street. A black SUV that no one inside had noticed idled once at the mouth of the parking lot, 3 long seconds, and then, unhurried, drove off into the snow.